So at a personal level, kind of want to talk about what I'm doing to try to do this and what my experience has been, because it's not easy, that's for sure. And I'm incredibly privileged compared to most people, and it still hasn't been easy. But yeah, I have a 15-year-long career in corporate agriculture, conventional agriculture, across the Midwest and the West. And, I've made good money compared to the average person. In a lot of ways, I had great benefits. But about 5 years ago, I started to realize through a process of, using psychedelics and meditation and hiking and just thinking and researching, that the current operating system of agriculture was just completely and totally unsustainable and far too extractive. So I started going down the rabbit hole of regenerative agriculture. And naturally, this was a 5-year process where I went back and forth of like, okay, well, I've got a mortgage to pay, I've got bills to pay, I have a wife who depends on me, we want to have a family. I've got these golden handcuffs, so to speak, of the corporate world where I have really good pay and vacation time and, benefits and whatnot. By the end of the day, it was totally unfulfilling to me. The majority of my time is spent on Zoom call or Teams calls, virtually. As you climb up in the corporate world, right, you spend less and less time in the field. So in the beginning of my career, I got to spend more time actually on the ground with farmers. But as you climb up into middle management, you spend more and more time in meetings. And that was just personally unfulfilling to me because I want to spend time outside. And then also I matched that feeling internally with what I saw going on externally, that I was adding my energy in life to a massively negative system. And I kind of talked about in my last series of videos too, like, I don't disparage people who work in that as individuals. It's a system that's set up with bad incentives. But somebody has to step out and take a risk, or else it's never going to change. And so I decided it was worth it to try to be one of those people. So I left my corporate job 6 months ago. Now, I guess I should say I left my full-time position. I took on a contractor role, so I lost all my benefits. Basically, like overall, probably took like a 35% cut in benefits and pay. But what it allowed me to do now is I can still pay my bills and stuff with this contracting role, and it's fully remote, so it allows me the time to start my farm, which is back in Indiana. And that's was worth it to me for the risk. And as I said, I'm in an incredibly privileged position because this farm is fully paid off. It's been in my family for 120 years. My family's in a good position financially, and my parents are helping me start it. So I have a lot of advantages that other people don't have. But what I encourage people to do is just think about what are those things in your life, right? This wasn't an easy process. It took a lot of time. But eventually I started to realize, like, you know what? I found the intersection point of where I have knowledge and skills in agriculture because I have a career and I've spent a lot of time in it, researching it. It also checks the box of my genuine interest in something that really gives me energy and drive. It also checks the box of something that I know when change can be a massive positive for the world, especially if I can be part of that change. So if you find something that crosses all those things off, I think you really struck gold, and that kind of tells you, that provides the compass of where you should point, right? And I mean, it's taken me 35 years to figure that out. So it's not something that happens overnight, that's for sure. But other things I've been doing outside of starting this farm, right, is like, I'm also kind of just rethinking how I see existence, or how I see kind of the definition of success and making it in this world, the way it's set up, right? So number one, like, rather than maximizing how much money I make, I want to work on the other side of the equation and massively decrease how costly it is for me to live a fulfilling life, because then I don't need to make that much money, right? And I think that's another huge piece of this conversation I rarely hear people talk about is, right, my wife and myself worked really hard on paying off all our college debt, and having, we buy only used vehicles, for instance, right? So we don't have any car debt. Our only debt is our mortgage, and it is in a nice place, so I hope it continues to appreciate. But even that, I'm right now considering a pretty major step, which is completely and totally against conventional wisdom, of liquidating our 401 or IRA to pay that mortgage off. So then we really would basically not have to make much money at all to survive from month to month. And that's such a freeing feeling to me. Like, that's something, even though I haven't done it yet, just thinking about it really excites me, because that's when you find true freedom, I think, and creativity. Because you don't have that weight hanging over your head every month. So that's something I encourage people to think about, is what's the minimum that you need materially to be fulfilled and happy in this world? Because I promise you, it's been said a million times, but money does not buy happiness. And if you need proof of that, like, look at the Epstein files, because the more of it that you attain in this world, the worse of a person you will become. It's like a direct correlation. And so that's another thing that I think builds a resilient person. And the more resilient people like that, the more resilient society at scale becomes. Because if we need less, we extract less. If we extract less, the world is more resilient. We're more in balance and harmony with nature. And we can apply that mindset to so many aspects of the world, from energy production to food production to technology, mining, so many things that are fundamental to our way of life that are very detrimental to other parts of the world that we offshore that suffering to. And one last thing I'll kind of touch on in my personal experience is really investigate inwardly, do a lot of introspection throughout this process, right? To really discover what your true motives are for a change like this, if you're considering it. Because I had this experience before I started my farm. It was just actually the experience, the job that brought me out to Colorado, is I became one of the first, about 5-7 years ago, I became one of the first 20 employees of a cannabis startup out in Colorado, on the farm team, helping grow 3,000 or so acres of cannabis, which was probably at that time the largest grow that had been done in 100 years, because it was right after the Farm Bill had been passed. And my motives for that were totally selfish, right? Like, I was excited for it because I was like, oh, I'm going to be on the ground floor of the next Amazon. I'm going to become super rich. I got stock options for the company when I started, and I was like, oh, that's going to go through the roof, and I'm going to be on the frontier of this next big thing and make a ton of money, be able to retire early and just enjoy a life of leisure and happiness. And then ultimately, as often happens with startups, the company completely imploded and burnt through $5 billion in a few years. And now it trades for pennies on the stock exchange. And that was it took me a few years to realize it, and a couple mushroom trips to realize that, that was the universe teaching me a lesson for having completely selfish motives for something that I saw as a big change in my life. And now I've gone through that process of introspection and alignment, and aligning my values with my action, with what I put my energy into, with my creativity, and with what I know is better for the world. Yeah, after going through that experience of realizing that the universe was teaching me a lesson for my selfishness, I've, completely realigned how I view my next, foray out of the corporate world with this farm, right? It's like the startup was kind of the first attempt at me achieving this, but it had bad incentives behind it. Now I'm trying to do a new version of that with what I think is much better incentives, because I truly am doing this because I'm passionate about it and because I really believe it could fundamentally change society for the better and reverse some of the biggest issues we see right now, like climate change and conflict and war, right? I think the more that you align your incentives and your reasons for doing things in a moral way, the more you'll see the messages kind of coming back to you that you're on the right path, right? If you listen and pay attention. So the more that you give out that positive energy, the more you see it reciprocated back to you. And I've had a few instances of that in the last couple of years that have really encouraged me that, as difficult as it can be, I am on the right track now with the right incentives and reasons. So those are kind of the reasons why I think every one of us should seek this change in our lives, as difficult as it may seem or be, and what I'm personally doing within my life to achieve it. Not that I'm there yet again, but I'm trying to maintain faith and walk the path. And finally, I'll leave with the point that the reason, we're ultimately in a battle against authoritarianism. And that can take on many shapes and forms politically and economically, and different isms and words that are used for it. But ultimately, it's the consolidation of control, wealth, power, influence in fewer hands, right? That's authoritarianism. And in order to reverse that, we have to engage with ourselves to understand how we can become more resilient and how we can become a member of a community that we can provide our skills to and have that reciprocated back to us with other people who are also open and have valuable skills and insight and knowledge that we can learn from. And that's how you build resilient individuals and a resilient community and society at large. Because I think ultimately, authoritarianism is attractive to people when there is fear and when there is something perceived as missing or needed, right? I think that's kind of how authoritarianism instantiates on each side of the political spectrum, right? So when you think about authoritarian communism, that comes from the lack of control over production and economic opportunity. So something's massively missing in your life because you live in a tough environment where you don't have all the basic needs because you're being, extracted from by someone above you. And so you desire that leftist version of authoritarianism to wrest back control for yourself and to put all of the power in the hands of the state to do that for you. And then on the right-hand side, I think it's mostly driven by fear authoritarianism, right? And the need for perceived safety because there's some other that is, threatening your way of life. That's how it's always set up on the right-wing side. And both of these, I think, are flawed, obviously. And the way to defeat both of them is to break down your walls, become more open, maximize your own personal ability, so that way you can offer it freely and openly to others, and then they can reciprocate back and will reciprocate it back, their own skills and ability to you. And then you don't need to rely on massive institutions of control like governments or corporations to provide you with the things you need to live a fulfilling and happy life. So that's kind of how I view the situation, and yeah, be interested to know your thoughts, and challenge you to think about what ways you can pursue this in your own life.